Apple Knocker Radio.
All right. Greetings, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. The man sitting before you is Keith Joseph. He's an instructor at the Institute for Hermetic Studies, which is located in Northeast Pennsylvania, is run by Mark Stavish. Previously been a guest on here, and I reference Mark's work all the time. At the Institute for Hermetic Studies, Keith gave a great presentation on theurgy, and I'm looking forward to talking to him about that in the future. But today we're talking about something very different. And today's conversation actually stemmed from an email exchange between Keith and I, where he just tossed out, like nonchalantly, like Rip Torn throwing out confetti like it was nothing. He says, I think Karl Marx is the prophet of the Kali Yuga. And I just said, dude, we got to talk about that, man. Like, that is fascinating. Number one, it's a fascinating topic. But number two, Keith has unique insights on this. Keith does not come at this topic as just a passive observer. Keith lived in the world. Keith was a communist organizer, as he's going to tell us shortly. And Keith knows the philosophy of communism, but he also knows what it just feels like to be a communist and to be in that, what we would call an egregore, which may be a term not everybody's familiar with. But regardless, Keith is uniquely positioned to give some really interesting insights into this. So I said, Keith, man, we got to talk about this. Keith obliged, which I very much appreciate. Before we get into that, I do want to read a passage very quickly from this book called Letters from Russia, 1919, by P.D. Ouspensky. I know there's a lot of fourth way folks out there, so you'll all know Ouspensky. For those of you who aren't familiar, Ouspensky was kind of like Gurdjieff's top student for a while. They had a bit of a falling out, but he's still to this day is one of the best. His writings are some of the best entryways into the fourth way, like him and J.G. Bennett, Maurice Nicoll, and a few others. But so Ouspensky was actually in Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, and he was writing back to his friend in England. And so this book is a collection of those letters. And for the people who aren't familiar with the Bolsheviks, that's what led into the Soviet communists. So for all intents and purposes, talking about the same thing. Obviously, there's a lot of nuances there, but it's kind of the same thing. And so I'm going to read this passage because to those people who think, well, maybe this is a little extreme, calling Karl Marx the prophet of the Kali Yuga, I find this passage just, number one, fascinating. But number two, it gives an entryway into a brilliant mind who is esoterically inclined, who was there witnessing these things happen and what he perceived, which to me is just incredibly fascinating. And so Ouspensky writes, such is the position at present. Unhappily, you do not realize what will happen if the Bolsheviks should gain a victory over Russia, or even if Bolshevism is allowed to remain for some time as a state, governing immense territories in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. The reason why you do not see the harm done to civilization by the rule of Bolshevism is undoubtedly the fact that you do not realize its true meaning. You mistake it for what it wishes to be mistaken for. But the essence of Bolshevism lies precisely in what it is not mistaken for. You think Bolshevism is a political system that can be discussed, but whose existence cannot be denied. In reality, Bolshevism is not a political system at all. It is something very old that at different times has borne different names. The Russian language of the 18th century knew a name, preserved until now, Pugachevchina, which renders very well the essence of Bolshevism. Pugachev was a Ural Cossack who pretended to be the deceased Emperor Peter III and who raised an insurrection against Catherine II and for a time succeeded in seizing half of Russia. He plundered the estates of landowners, hanged their owners and priests, gave the land to the peasantry, etc. A classical description of the Pugachevchina is to be found in a novel by our poet Pushkin, A Captain's Daughter. But Bolshevism of the 20th century has one peculiarity. It is made in Germany, and Germany knows how to make use of it. Employing Bolshevism in 1917 to break up the Russian army, Germany destroyed the danger menacing her eastern front. You were in great peril, and you know it. The person he's writing to is in the UK, so he's saying you were in great peril. He's talking about the British. But now you have decided that the peril is gone, and you are mistaken. Germany is not annihilated or even weakened. She is energetically and cleverly preparing a revanche. Her chief enemy is England, and the chief trump in her pack is Russian Bolshevism. Now, I read that passage not because it really directly goes into what Keith's going to get into, but because it shares the idea that this thing that we now call socialism or communism, and I understand socialism was supposed to be the entry into communism. First, you have a socialist state and then a communist state. For our intents and purposes, kind of the same thing, or it is the same thing. We're talking about this force, this primeval force that has been summoned and awakened and is wholly destructive by nature. And that's why I wanted to share this, because you are by no means the first person to conceptualize it this way. But I read that mostly for the audience to know we're going to get to. But before we get to that point, Keith, can you tell us your story, how you, just your background, your life, how you got into communism? Because it number one informs the subject, but number two shows your credentials because you know communism. I've heard you talk about communism. You're not like a guy who wears a Che Guevara shirt and talks about free cigarettes and stuff. Like you know the theory. You know these things at a level I've not met many people who can reference these obscure works the way that you can. And so with that, could you get into your background a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So not to toot my horn, but at the end of my time as a communist, I would get frustrated because there wasn't that many people that you could have a serious discussion about the theory with, because it isn't really read as carefully as I start to read it at the end. But we'll get to that. When I was a teenager, I was into like skateboarding and anarchism, like just as like a kind of goof. That was the bands, that was like the vibe, that was the scene. So, but I'm kind of extreme by nature. So if I'm like, if I'm going to put an anarchist symbol on my skateboard, I'm going to dig into it and figure out what that's all about. So that was kind of my entryway was kind of anarchist theory in high school, and it was in the 80s, so politics was a lot more fun, less serious, kind of, you could kind of goof around with it a
Right.
little bit. It wasn't like, life or death. I don't, it was just a lot more lighthearted. So like I could be friends with people that were, liberals or conservatives, and I could throw out anarchist ideas and we would just banter and it was fun. It was nothing. It was just fun. And then when I got to college, I got actually more interested in spiritual stuff. I got turned on to acid and LSD and mushrooms and all that, and that that definitely captured my imagination, and I got interested in all of a lot of esoteric stuff. I had Rigardi's books and Crowley's books and Zen
Oh, really?
Buddhism and all that stuff. Yeah, I didn't understand it that well, but I was interested in it. I didn't have any teachers or anything, so there was just the books, and you read the book of the law and it's just not that without some context or some help, it's pretty weird. But there was that. And then we had talked about, I had a rock band for a little while and was really into the Doors, and
Yeah,
that
what
was
was the name
part
of
of
your
the
band?
acid thing. So we were initially called Lomar, and then as I got into Marxism, um, we had like a change of the lineup and the guitar player left and we got a new guitar player, and then I pushed to change the name of the band to Liberation. And I was
Oh,
at that point I was like really moving to the left, or
mm.
was interested in these ideas. And that was kind of that ended up wrecking the band, because I want to be a full-time activist by that point. So that's in the early 90s. The war in
Because
Iraq had a
you
big
achieved a
impact.
sorry to interrupt,
Yeah,
but
go
your
ahead.
band, I just want to be clear for everyone else. Like your band, you had success with it, right? Like
Yeah,
you
we were playing in the local bars around New Brunswick in New Jersey, and there was a pretty vibrant scene. It was contemporaneous with the grunge thing. New Brunswick scene, the scene where I wasn't really a grunge thing, but it was, there was stuff happening. There was young bands getting signed, so there was a lot of excitement,
mm.
and it was an interesting scene musically. A lot of venues, a lot of places to play. It was a college scene. Um, and we can get into that maybe another time, but I would attribute all my success in the music thing to the theurgy that I was doing
Oh yeah.
haphazardly and unaware, not really knowing what I was doing with it, but really assuming just in reading so much about the Doors and Bob Marley and really like trying to imitate that, not in such an overt way. I don't think you would have known that that's what I was doing just by looking, but it really had there's a lot of power there in those practices. So, and I would point to my success there because I'm not a talented musician or singer or anything. So that I would really say that there was, other forces that I was able to summon somehow. So that I think that's evidence to the efficacy of those practices. But it was the left was kind of the freedom movement of the time. When I was in high school, it was Reagan was the president, and they had the war on drugs, which felt oppressive for I don't know what reason. It wasn't like I was doing a lot of drugs, but it was like a kind of oppressive vibe. They had a police state kind of vibe to it, I guess, or at least that was my perception as a teenager. And they were pushing the PMRC thing. It was the Parents Music Resource Center, to try to
Oh,
control
right.
the music. And I mean, the music then was so tame that they were talking about compared to what's out there now. I mean, it's like it's a totally different world. But they were going even after like John Denver for singing Rocky Mountain High, right? That was a glorification of drugs or
John
something, right? I
Denver,
mean,
he's
so
like a
yeah, John
national
Denver,
hero,
right?
man.
So and so like I mean, John Denver's music is so. I mean, it's cool. I mean, it's like so prosaic compared to
Right.
what's out there now. So that all kind of pushed me to be on the left, I guess. And then the war in Iraq happened when I was in school in college, and I was also fascinated with the '60s and the counterculture. You know, S is part of that, but the anti-war movement was part of that. So there was a war. So this is great. It's almost like a redoing of the '60s, at least in my mind. And so I got into the anti-war movement that way. And then at Rutgers, there was leftist professors, and there was some pretty sophisticated Marxist professors. Someone challenged that in a previous video, so I'll just mention names. Steve Bronner was a Marxist professor. He might have got run out of there. He used to have affairs with the girl students.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
not trying to slander him, but whatever. It was a well-known thing. I think he
I think
even
that's pretty common with professors of any
yeah,
political
and I think he
stripe.
even justified. I think he even said it was part of the college experience. I don't. I'm not. I really don't want to slander him. But
Right. No, yeah, that's cool.
whatever. It was like his. It was his thing. But he was a really. I mean, he could talk for 2 hours. Frankfurt School and Adorno and Marcuse and all these guys and fascinated. I mean, I was fascinated. I was definitely fascinated by him. The activist students didn't love him because he had that reputation with the women, and the feminist thing was a big part of what we were doing. It was the thing that was separating the generation that I was, which I guess was Generation X, from like the baby boomer Marxists who had kind of were the new left from the '60s. So there was, at least from the perspective of the activists when I was there was a lot of misogyny in the '60s, and so they were, and I think even there was all these quotes. Stokely Carmichael said, Stokely Carmichael was a leader of SNCC who became a really radical kind of black nationalist. And he said like the proper position of women is prone, and they should be getting our
Oh,
coffee, and so that was so at the time when I was, women's oppression so-called was the main thrust of a lot of the activity. So this professor wasn't that liked, but he was there. His students were graduate students. They were teaching classes. Amity Baraka had a big impact on us. He was teaching there. He was a leftist that was part of a group called the United Slaves in the '60s. They invented Kwanzaa. Ron Karenga started the first Black Studies program in UCLA. And so Baraka was connected with that on the East Coast. And they had got the first Black mayor elected in Newark. It was the first Black mayor of a major Northeastern city. They had this big conference of Black mayors in like '72 in Gary, Indiana. And so a lot of the Black kind of Democratic Party leadership came out of that. So again, I don't care about this guy making a comment, but he did make this comment that like leftists have no power. the black mayors, the black Democratic mayors that came out of the 70s are all coming out of the far left. Not the
Hmm.
mayor themselves may not be the far left, but their whole organization and the whole push. So they might get a more moderate kind of spokesperson, but that was the push. And so you have those black Democratic mayors in the cities, they're coming out of that um, organization, right? And they're hooked into the Democratic Party. And if you remember, like Walter Mondale and that stuff, there was communists all over his campaign. Like, oh, Jesse Jackson, that's a communist coalition was organizing his campaign in the 80s. And the only way you just don't know that is because you're just ignorant of history. If you look into it, just scratch it, it's right there. They weren't
Right.
hiding; they're out in the open. So anyway, so that's they were people that were teaching at Rutgers that I was connected with. I became pretty close to Baraka. He's a very charismatic figure. His poetry, his spoken word poetry events. So there was a cultural scene in the 90s around left-wing politics that was way more vibrant than what you might think of if you're familiar with kind of 21st century left politics, where it's just all Nurse Ratched, school marm, um, not fun at all, totally corny and repressive. It wasn't like that in the early 90s. It was way
Hmm.
more freewheeling and fun and spirited, and um, it was a different kind of politics, or at least cultural. So I got involved in that, and we had a little student organization at Rutgers, or there was a bunch of student organizations at Rutgers. Um, at the time, I was in like a white student group, and then there was a black student group and a Latino student group, and we were trying to find ways of working together. The black
Hmm.
student groups were kind of nationalistic, meaning that they wanted to have a black group, and the Latino groups were the same. So then the white kids were all together, but there was a lot of self-loathing. That stuff was starting back then, the anti-white kind of
Hmm.
discourse that you hear now. Um, but since we weren't nationalists, we became communists. So they were a little more mitigated. We were the most radical in terms of the communist theory, because that was the kind of thing that gave us our identity and unique. And then the feminism thing. So we were
Hmm.
championing the women, what they called it, the women question. We were reading, there's a Lenin anthology that you can probably find. It's called Lenin on the Women Question. The big piece in there was a letter that or an interview he did with a communist woman named Clara Zetkin about how to liberate women. And then we were reading much more radical stuff as well. Well, there was the other one was Engels. Frederick Engels wrote a book, Family, Private Property, and the State, about women's oppression,
Hmm.
how primitive communism had equality between men and women and this sort of thing. And so we were reading that. And then you also books like The Dialectic of Sex by Firestone Shulmuth, where she was saying stuff that we're seeing now that was supposed to be third wave feminism. She's saying the oppression of women is based on the fact that they give birth to children. Therefore, the liberation of women will be the separation of the reproduction of the human being
Hmm.
from women. So now we're talking about Kali Yuga stuff. Right?
Right. Right.
You're the fact that women are mothers is the basis of their oppression. The fact that they have to go through pregnancy and childbirth is the basis of their oppression. Therefore, the liberation of women will be the separation of women from that. So that was stuff that
Hmm.
we were reading. And there's a whole once you go there, the whole gender studies, the whole women's studies department at Rutgers, there's a women's college, Douglas College. So all radical feminists are there, right? Andrea
Right.
Dworkin, you're reading Judith Butler and this stuff. That stuff is far out. So we're reading all that stuff, and it's influencing our politics and this sort of thing. And then we ran political campaigns. We ran a lot of anti-police brutality stuff. There was some pretty brutal police. They killed a prostitute in the middle of the night,
Hmm.
and there was like a notorious cop in town that the local people called Crater Face. So we started to organize anti-police brutality things. We had big demonstrations, in the late 90s, once we got out of college, and we just stayed in this city and we tried to organize there. So we were in there, and then I went to graduate school and I studied with David Harvey, who's a prominent Marxist in New York City. Rick Wolf, who you'll see on YouTube now, he's become very prominent. I studied with him in the early 2000s in New York City. He used to teach classes at New School and this Brecht Forum. And so then I started to read Marx's economic theory, which is it's difficult, it's dense. Das Kapital, it's 3 volumes. The first volume was published when he was alive, so it's pretty polished. It's got literary references. It's not fun to read, but it's polished. Then the other ones are kind of like notes. So there's second volume, the third volume. There's a huge volume, 1,000 pages, theories of surplus value, where it's all notes. So I was reading all that stuff deep into it. And that's what kind of started me to get out of it. Was I don't want to go into the intricacies of communist theory, but I'll give you a taste. Lenin had this idea that the 20th century capitalism was different than 19th century capitalism. So 20th century capitalism was different than what Marx studied. And so this is kind of a dogma that's accepted among the left now, which is why they don't read that pretty daunting Marx material, because they're saying actually capitalism developed in a way that Marx didn't foresee. Lenin foresaw it. And so we're Leninists now, because Leninism is Marxism in this new stage of capitalism, which he called imperialism and monopoly capitalism. And so in that way, they kind of disconnect Lenin from Marx. And you don't really, so like academics will read Marx's economics, but a lot of like your run-of-the-mill leftists on the street haven't read it. And their reasoning is because capitalism is different now. I think, and I started to say that was wrong. I started to write papers about how that was wrong. I started to, debate everyone on the internet, anyone that I could get into a debate about that this was wrong. That alienated me from Amity Baraka, who I was close with, because Lenin's theory was a big part of his understanding of how Black people would organize. He wasn't a Black nationalist, but intricate Marxist theory. He was a Marxist, but a Black nationalist, or a Marxist who had special interest in how he called it the Black nation, would organize itself in America. So, and Lenin was a basis of his thinking about that, because if you think about the 20th century, all those anti-colonial movements in Africa and Latin America, Vietnam, they're all based on Lenin's theory. And so he was, animated by that also, Lenin's theory of national liberation. So anyway, I know that's like so like dense of theory, but that's kind of how I got out of it, because I got into that. I got into it so deeply and was arguing out that I was like, well, these guys are wrong, and they don't even want to actually argue it. They just want to kind of dogmatically say we're right. And so that was, and then the other big thing, which is relevant to now, I think, is Marx's claim to be scientific is all based in those economic volumes, Das Kapital, because it's very intricately organized or thought out theory of the causes and effects of capitalism, right? This thing causes this to happen, this causes this to happen, and it's really intricate. And you could make an argument that it's a kind of science, I would say. But there's nothing scientific about Mao or Lenin. They're just politicians, right? There's no justification for saying scientific. So they're all saying it's basically a cargo cult. They're all saying Lenin's science. I'm like, this isn't science. This is he's writing a political article in 1905 in Russia. It's not different than Churchill. I mean, it's different politics, but it's not scientific. It's the same thing. It's just political ideas. There's no you can't call it science.
Right.
So there's basically like a cargo cult, right? Of Marxism is modern Marxism, a cargo cult, right? A cargo cult is, settlers or colonists will have like this radio, and they'll be calling in shipments, and they have their setup, and they're on the a ham radio or CB, and they're in contact with airplanes, and airplanes that land and deliver goods. They leave, and the natives pick up the thing, and they start thinking that by like talking gibberish into it, they're going to get, deliveries of goods, but there's no setup. There's nothing there, right? It doesn't work anymore. It's just a broken radio. That's what Marxism is. Modern Marxism is a broken radio. It's a cargo cult.
Hmm. You got to say, man, something that's very interesting. This happens every time I hear you talk about this subject. Just kind of a personal observation is that, I'm a very intellectually inclined person. I love economics. I like to read. I like to think. And it's interesting to me because to put it lightly, I do not think well of socialism. We'll just say
Right.
it that way. But yet, when I hear somebody like you talk, like it kind of appeals to something in me because you don't see this kind of immersion in intellectuality. Intellectuality is not even where
Mm-hmm.
you don't
No.
see that kind of immersion much anymore. And so when I hear somebody like you talking, there's this part of me that's like, oh, dude, I kind of wouldn't mind like hanging out with some people where we're like really drilling down into this
Yes.
theory and stuff. And it's interesting to me because it makes me wonder, and if this thing is like an egregore, if it is this collective thought form and something that has its own pull and is trying to pull something in, if that's like another way that it pulls people in, because just you talking, I want to read these books and like I want to debate you. It just that for
Uh-huh.
fun because
Uh-huh.
it's like a
Yes.
passionate thing, and it makes me wonder how much of the pull is pulling at the mind, which then makes me think of like Ahriman and the Steiner and the Age of Ahriman, but that's a different topic. But please continue. Please continue.
So what you just said is, I think, is a really great point, right? So, in the early 2000s, now I was an activist for 10 years, and I'm like, all right, I really want to study this theory. There's serious professors at the graduate level doing it. In New York City, there's a guy named Anwar Sheikh at the New School for Social Research, Marxist economics. I mean, the guy was literally an aerospace engineering student that switched to economics. So like
Wow.
super, super smart, right? And like he's going through the theory really carefully. So there is like this aura of being a serious intellectual, right? And it's not math, intellectual, or physics or something. It's social science, but really serious, and not um not like, now when you hear like critical theory, there's something kind of goofy about it, critical race theory. This was way more sophisticated, way more interesting. Like you said, really, um, there's an attraction to it because you're going to do a kind of cultural analysis where you're looking at the economic developments of capitalism and then how they're expressed culturally, how they're used to manipulate people to either consume or support the system. So there's a lot of assumptions there of how it works, but really in depth stuff where you can really kind of think about it. And since you don't have a spiritual life, this is all you have, right there.
Right.
Religion is the opiate of the masses in that theory. And so once you've cut that off, that's all you have is this intellectual life. And if you like to kind of nerd out, it's there's a lot of attraction there because what else are you going to really do that with? So yeah, and like if you read like Adorno and Marcuse, it's interesting and dense, hard to read. You have to like work at it, like so it's like a puzzle, and it's like it's fun that way if you're into that. Um, the Marcuse book, One Dimensional Man, really, really interesting, right? I mean, he's like,
Mhm.
capitalism creates these conditions where all you do is go to work and watch TV and die, and that's your life, and it's a one-dimensional thing. It's wrecked your spiritual life, and there's a lot to what he's saying that's true, and
Right.
it's interesting to think about how that affects the culture. And that book is super influential in the 60s, right? Because that's kind of, it's also giving energy to the countercultural stuff,
Mhm.
the hippies, and which, if you dig into that, there was a split then between the political people and the anti-war people and the cultural people. There was people that were just like Grateful Dead, take acid, dance around, and
Right. Right.
and then maybe they had this idea that they could unite. That's like the electric Kool-Aid acid test stuff and Ken Kesey, that they could unite with the working class to like the Hells Angels, right? So that they had like, that was a super romantic idea of the working class, right? So this would be like the coolest expression of the working class from a certain point of view, like Hells Angels. So we're gonna have parties with Allen Ginsberg and the Hells Angels together, and we're gonna, that's gonna be the thing, and that's gonna be awesome. But then they they had the Hells Angels do security at a Rolling Stone concert, and they
Yeah,
killed that
yeah,
dude. And so
yeah. That
that,
didn't go so well.
and so I think in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Hunter Thompson says that was the end of the 60s. It was the end of the dream, the end of the,
Yeah,
and then
Altamont.
then it
Altamont,
became
you're referring to?
dystopian. Yeah, yeah. And
But
Fear and
there was
Loathing, he
also
says
that
that.
Jefferson Airplane performance that I think it was in one of the it was in like Golden Gate Park or something like that, where they beat the hell out of those
They
hippies.
beat
Because
somebody. Yeah.
in Altamont, and I
Right,
don't want to
right,
go on a tangent, but
right,
you can
right,
kind of actually defend the Hells Angels there because that dude, that Meredith Hunter, I think his name
right,
was, he
right,
did have a gun in his hand. So you
right,
got to give the Hells Angels credit there.
right, right.
But that one at the Golden Gate Park, that was just them beating the hell
Well,
out of hippies with
because they
pool
were
sticks.
they were anti-war kids, and the Hells Angels were all vets.
Oh
So
shoot,
yeah,
I
yeah.
never
So
even
they're
thought about
yeah,
that,
yeah. So
man.
they weren't going for that. They weren't. So,
Right,
and that was a and that's a constant thing in the 60s, and that's how you get into like the cultural Marxism stuff, because they had that that incident in on the West Coast, and on the East Coast they had this, they call it, it became known as like the hard hat march, but it was a whole bunch of construction workers, union guys, supporting the Vietnam War
hmm.
and in a march. So they're marching. So suddenly the working class is supporting the wrong thing, and you're starting to lose the. It's not working. It's not going the way it's supposed to go. Um,
Right,
and that happens now, right? They're mad about Brexit because people are voting the wrong way, and they instead of calling them working class, they want to say the uneducated, or the people without a college education, because
right, right,
they don't want to give up the cachet of the term working class
right.
to their political enemies.
Yeah,
So,
I was actually thinking about that the other day, and we'll get into the Kali Yuga right after I share this insight that I had for whatever it's worth. Because I was thinking about this and about how the working classes tend to, they don't fall for shit as much as the educated classes. And I was really thinking about like, why is that really? And like people say, well, it's because they're closer to the ground, they're working with the earth, they're working with the more tangible things. Yeah, but like really why? And I had this thought because I think at least part of it. And so I grew up blue collar. I worked blue collar jobs up until I was in my late 20s, and I still consider myself a blue collar guy at heart. I just prefer talking with blue collar guys. But what I think might be at least part of it is that when you're an intellectual person, you're always hyper focused on the intellectual aspect of it. But the working class, they never forget the fact that it's a human being who's saying this stuff. And human beings are full of shit, and human beings lie, and human beings' motives are near almost never what they say they are. Like I have no doubt that somebody like you got into the theory, you really believed it. But most people, I'm not even talking consciously. Or I don't think, I'm very confident. Unconsciously, we don't really know what drives us most of the time. We think we do. And we can grab hold of an idea and be like, no, dude, it's because I believe in this so much. It's like, no, dude, it was because you got your ass kicked when you were 5 years old on the playground. Like that's really what's happening here. You know what I mean? And I just think maybe in working class, they don't lose touch of that. They don't forget about that. They remember it's a person, and that no matter what a person says, at the end of the day, they are a person. And their theory and their intellectual ideas might be perfect, but they were still a kid that got his ass kicked when he was 5 years old and wants revenge.
right,
And I just think when you're working class, you never forget that because it's just the way you interact with people on a daily basis. It's more real in a sense, as opposed to when you're a white collar worker and you're going in the boardroom and everybody's full of shit. And I don't want to put it down because that has its place and there's reasons for it, and there are even some good aspects to it. But anyway,
yeah, no, I think that what you're saying is right. There's a level of kind of mediation of reality that the intellect imposes on things, that if you're not overthinking it, you don't have that. Like even like we were talking about the guy that um killed that homeless dude in New York City, right? the way that you make him into a criminal when he's obviously trying to help other people is you have all this like crazy ideas about the injustice of what that homeless person is going through, and there's all this convoluted thinking where to come out to the idea that that person is just not a criminal, there's something else, and therefore the guy that stopped the criminal is actually the criminal. That takes a whole bunch of like crazy thinking, you know what I mean? Like you really gotta bounce. It's like a ping pong ball it's a web that's very hard to unwind when what you just see in front of you is this guy's attacking people, this guy's stopping him from attacking people, and that's the end of the story. There's nothing else to it, right? There's no justification for why this guy's attacking people and he's poor and he's under advantage, and you don't have any of that, because I go to work every day and I pay my bills, and that's I can do it, you can do it. Like that's all there is to it. And so I think the intellectuals can get really spun out in their minds. And I know that's true because that happened to me. I mean, I can understand.
Continually have to pull myself back,
no, I can understand how
I
you
still
can
go that direction.
make a crazy thing out of something that's a little more obvious, or that is obvious.
Right. And so all right, so this will be a good I think this is a good segue into the kind of the second half, which would be the meat of what we really want to talk about. And thank you for all that background, all that thought. Dude, I love that stuff, and I could talk about that for hours. But so we have Keith, communist organizer, clearly knows the theory, was not messing around. He was not an amateur in this stuff. But then we get to the point. You get out of it, and now you have come to see Marx as, well, potentially the prophet of the Kali Yuga. And I'll let you get into this, obviously yourself, but let me quickly say to people who aren't familiar with what the Kali Yuga is. I believe it's Hindu, right? It's specifically Hindu. It's this idea that there's this cycle. I think there's 4 periods, and the Kali Yuga is the densest, most physical, and most like depraved period when everything kind of starts spinning out of control. The reason why I frame it that way is because I like to read all kinds of traditions, all kinds of people. And to me, the way I perceive it is the Kali Yuga is like the name that the Hindus put on it. But I think the underlying philosophy has actually been talked about in all kinds of spiritual traditions and thinkers. Like Steiner talked about the age of Ahriman, which I've kind of been fascinated about for a while. But then you even have Carl Jung, who talked about the age of the Antichrist. And if you see how he perceived this age of the Antichrist, it is basically the Kali Yuga. He was just, he wasn't coming at it from a Hindu lens. And so basically, to me, we're going to talk specifically about the Kali Yuga, but I think of it in a more of a general sense that humanity, we work in these big cycles. And at the end of the cycle, one could even say the book of Revelations is talking about the end cycle of this, not the end of all time, the end of this cycle. And so yeah, to those people who may not be familiar with Kali Yuga, that's how I perceive it. But could you talk about how you think of the Kali Yuga and how you connect it to Marx?
Right. So I think it's also in Hesiod, right? There's like the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. So it is this idea of cycles of history. It's a little less familiar to us because in Christianity, it's more like a linear thing with the beginning and the end, and like there's this kind of linear idea of history. But even in like ancient Greece, but in other cultures, it's cyclical. And so, you're starting at like the Golden Age, and that's, I think, how it is in Hinduism as well, the Golden Age. And in the Golden Age, human beings are closest to God. They're closest to the divine. There's almost no separation. So you don't even have like prayer and ritual. It's just, you're kind of living the divine, even like the Garden of Eden, maybe, right? Like you're right there with God. And then these kind of falls happen. And it's even in the Tao Te Ching, now that I think about it, there's, where you're living the way. And then at the end, you just have before you have complete chaos, you've lost morality, you've lost the way, you've lost morality. you've lost righteousness, and now you're just in custom, where I think that's where we are now. There's almost
Oh,
a hatred
interesting.
for Christianity and Christian morality, but what's holding this thing together is
Right, right.
is just like the custom of not like going, having complete mayhem. Um, and so the Kali Yuga then is the demonic age, the most materially dense age, when human beings are the furthest from God. And there's really interesting descriptions of those ages. And in the Republic, Plato has he calls it the myth of metals, and he connects it to a kind of caste system. But the
Really.
golden the gold is the philosopher kings, the silver is the warrior
Oh, right, right, right.
class, and then the bronze is the working class and the producing class. And he says there, if the bronze men ever ruled, there's the prophecy that doom will follow.
Hmm.
And so that's what I was thinking of when I was saying Marx is kind of a prophet of the Kali Yuga. It's in the descriptions of the Kali Yuga as well. The Sudra, right? The working classes will displace the Brahmin, and they'll be the rulers of the society. And when the
Hmm.
working classes rule the society, you have this kind of chaotic thing. So, we were talking about the kind of the good aspects of the working class, their kind of down to earthness, which I think if you actually meet working class people, they don't really want to be in charge of the society. They just want to be left
Right, right,
alone and work and
right,
have some security and raise their families. And there's not like some desire to be in charge, as long as everything is running right. As
right,
long
right.
as
Totally.
there's not chaos, and there's a level of security, and they can, do things for their families without being in danger. Like, that's really what and that's the idea, right? That they should be able to do that. They should be able to focus on their job, their work, their craft, their skill, and have the society run properly. One of the things that Marxism does is it creates resentment and envy in working class people, so that they want to like get out of that. And
Right.
if you think about this idea in the descriptions of the Kali Yuga, excuse me, in the description of the Kali Yuga, it says, right, the working class becomes in charge. Um, and now they're like out of their depth, and they're just in a position where they're not really capable of doing what they're supposed to do. And that's where I think Marx, that's the Marx as the prophet of the Kali Yuga, because his theory, I would separate into two parts. I would say there is a part that, if you want to say is science, I think you can make an argument for that. It's this kind of analysis of how capitalism develops. And then there's the politics. And the politics are this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So he says the proletariat is going to establish its dictatorship over the society, and rule in its own interest, and bring about the communist utopia. And that's the transition from socialism to communism. Socialism is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then communism is the utopia afterwards. So in Marx's theory, where I think there's valid things, you just start from the idea that everything, this would be the Hegelian idea, the dialectical thing. Everything is born, everything matures, everything dies. That's just
Right.
how things are. So Marx is looking at the birth of capitalism, the maturation of capitalism, and the death of capitalism, the end of capitalism. And the thing that he gets wrong is the timing. In 1865, he thinks capitalism is about to end, right?
Oh, he
But
did.
oh yeah, he was like,
Yeah.
gung ho, we're gonna do this stuff, and organizing, the International Workers Association, this sort of thing. But if you read like the theory, one of the books is called the Grundrisses, like the outline that he didn't finish, but it has the whole theory kind of laid out. He's saying that as capitalism develops, it's going to become a global system. It's going to touch every part of the world. It's going to create a world market. It's going to have international division of labor, basically stuff that's happening now, that took,
Right.
hundreds of years to develop. So I think he foresees that, and I'm sure, like, from his point of view, he doesn't want to say this is going to be 300 years from now. He was an activist. He wanted to be in the thick
Right.
of it. So that he gets the timing really wrong. But if you put that to the side, the way that he says capitalism will develop and end is that he calls it the tendency of the profit rate to fall. But what makes the profit rate fall is technological innovation.
Mm.
And because the source of profit is human labor, he calls it surplus value. And so people would get upset about that, but it's a very technical thing. It's not a moral category. And so the labor theory of value was the theory that Ricardo had, Adam Smith had. It's not unique to Marx. And so he says, if you take the labor theory of value and you think about human labor as a source of value, which isn't crazy, right? If I have a tree, what's going to make the tree into a table is human labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So human labor creates that value by working on raw materials. But the more you have technological innovation and technological development, the less and less human labor you have in the production process, the more it becomes mechanized, the more it becomes automated. And as you move towards automation, you're removing the source of value. And so that doesn't just create unemployment, it makes it harder to get profit. And the system only goes because people are seeking profit, right? That's why you have new capitalist development. So the system is kind of working against itself until it gets to these crises. And if you listen to like what people are talking about with AI, they talk about the technological singularity. I mean, that's what Marx is talking about.
Right.
The technological singularity is in Marx. Like he's talking about that. He's talking about moving towards complete automation. But he thinks that that's going to bring about a communist utopia.
Mm.
And the working class then is going to become in charge of the society. But where I think he's mistaken, or where I say the politics is just grafted upon that analysis, because that analysis I think is something to it, right? We're moving that way. There is going to be some sort of technological development where we're going to have more and more automation. It's creating unemployment, and the theory is that new technological development also creates new opportunities for jobs and so forth, but it seems like there's a limit to that, right? That's at least what's in the idea of the singularity, is that there's some limit to that technological development. On the other hand, Marx is saying, and I think this is just grafted on top of that, that the working class is going to create a dictatorship and they're going to be in charge and they're going to bring about this political utopia. If you read the theory, he's saying because of their position in the production process, they're going to seize hold of everything and they're going to be able to make a revolution. I don't see that. I also don't see I don't see how it follows. I also don't think, I think he assumes a level of human equality. And I know that this is way more controversial and offensive and everything, but human beings aren't the same. And I
No,
mean, I was
yeah,
a high
not
school
controversial with me, man.
I was a high school teacher, and there's a lot of kids that they can't even govern themselves.
Right, right.
And so they can't govern you, and you would not want them in charge of you. You wouldn't want them in charge of they need someone to give them guidance. And even as adults, they probably need to be under governance. So the idea that they're going to establish a dictatorship because they're at the bottom of the society over everybody else is bonkers. I mean, just bonkers. And
Right.
a lot of college professors don't understand that because they only interact with other college professors and maybe college students, and so their understanding of like the mass of human beings is just mistaken.
Right.
And I mean, and I know that it's like that stuff, you get into like offensive stuff, but the average IQ is 100. That's not very bright.
Right.
It's just not. You
Well,
don't
that's, I
want.
mean, even like to be swayed by philosophical ideals and moral ideals, you do have to have certain level of intelligence to be able to make these connections and understand why your actions matter. Even if you can get away with something, why you shouldn't do it anyway. That is an intellectual thing. People discuss it a lot as an emotional thing, but it really is intellectual. And it seems to me that if people lack the intellectual capacity to understand the broader implications of their actions, you can't appeal to them that way. Like you,
Right.
unfortunately, there are some people that they are only going to respond to the base impulses of pain and punishment, punishment and the carrot and the stick, and that's just how some people are. And yeah, I'm on
But
board with that, man. Like,
so I mean, that's what Plato says as the bronze. So he says there's the gold, the silver, and the bronze, and that's an individual, and it's also the social. And the bronzes are appetites. And so the bronze men can't rule the society's disaster, but the bronze can't rule the individual, right? Because if you're just enslaved to your appetites, and your appetites are dominating, you are enslaved, right? You can't control
right,
your you can't control your diet, you can't control your nutrition, you can't control anything. You're just being pushed around by your appetites. And so people that are pushed around by appetites can't be in charge of the society, right?
right,
That's a disaster. And that's the Kali Yuga also, because they want to romanticize that and glorify that and make that actually the norm where, right, everyone's just follows their appetites, bags of Doritos, pornography, McDonald's,
right,
just,
right,
right? There's no, and the idea that you should, take control over that and maybe not indulge all those appetites, that's oppression. But actually that's slavery, right?
right, right.
You're
Yeah,
enslaved by your appetites.
and before we started this recording portion, we had briefly chatted about these topics, and something you said about the Kali Yuga that I thought was very interesting, and I forget where you were. It might have been from Marx writings, or it might have been from that other woman that you referenced, but you said that it specifically stated that it would be a time when like things were flipped on their head, and like
Yeah.
what was good was made bad, what was virtuous was made vice. Could you just expand
Yes.
on that a little bit?
Yeah. So that was that Mark quotes it Mark Savage quotes it in one of his texts, and then he had recently posted about it, but it was from he's kind of a traditionalist author, Elaine Danilou. I think he's a guy, but Elaine Danilou. And he has this description of the Kali Yuga where he says, right, everything is inverted and upside down, socially or morally. And so what we normally think of as good is presented as bad, and what we would think of as bad is presented as good. Um, he even mentions specifically that women will slaughter their infants in their wombs, and like really like pretty close analysis of what we have now, that there will be no that the priests and the people that are supposed to be in charge of the moral development or the spiritual development side will just become kind of paid,
Mhm.
um, just money changing, money grubbing
It's
kind of thing.
incredible. It's incredible that he
It's
saw that.
how close it
Yeah.
is. And then Marx has the same idea in the uh manifesto. He says, and this I think is even more, it's more relevant now than when he wrote it originally. He said that because of he says the constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts in the air. All that is holy is profaned. And man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind.
Man,
So that is
not only is that incredibly accurate, but I also have to say, kind of a side note, I miss when people used to write like that, man. Like
amazing
I
writing.
miss like that's some poetry, even if he did, obviously if what he's describing isn't pleasant, but that's some eloquence and some
It's really
poetry.
great
But
writing.
yeah, so yeah, talking about this time when like nothing makes sense and everything's flipped on its head. I don't, this just popped into my mind, but I saw a couple months ago they had, there's that whole big thing going on between like the manosphere and the trad wife thing and all that, which it just pops into my feeds once in a while. I've seen a couple things. It's not something I'm particularly concerned about, but there was this one. I mean, it is a concerning thing. The inability of men and women to relate with each other is a problem, but it's just not something I'm thinking a lot about. But it was this interview with this young woman who was doing pornography or OnlyFans, whatever. I think that's basically the same thing. And she was also a Christian. And it was just really interesting because they asked her, they said, well, how can you be doing pornography if you're a Christian? And obviously she took a lot of flack for this. But what I thought was interesting was her answer was she said, well, Jesus loves unconditionally, and this is like what feels right to me. And so like Jesus would approve of this. Oh, because that the guy asked her, he said, do you think Jesus would approve of what you're doing? And you can tell she's sincerely, authentically, you know, she's a young woman, probably less than 25. She honestly was like wrestling with this and was like, yeah, I think he would because he loves everyone unconditionally. And what was interesting to me about it was everyone jumped dogpiled on this poor young girl. But the thing is, like it or not, she actually was expressing what a lot of people generically frame as the Christian ethos now.
Yes, right.
And the Christians who like really think about this and are really they could crush those arguments in a second. But the thing is, I don't think the average Christian could, which is what made me laugh about it, because it's like that is what your average Christians are. You are saying that Jesus loves you no matter what, and you can do whatever you want. So the poor girl, she was taking what you said and taking it to heart and living it. And now you're seeing the insanity of what this happens, that it can lead to her taking actions that otherwise would obviously be antithetical to biblical morality. And so it makes me think of this whole Kali Yuga thing where everything nothing makes any damn sense anymore. Nobody understands anything, and we're all just running, spinning our wheels, going in
Yeah.
circles.
Yeah,
You know what
yeah.
I
No,
mean?
I
Like,
think that's right.
but
And the
anyway, yeah. And so
I
this
mean,
Kali Yuga idea that Marx was the prophet of this. And obviously, I know this was kind of an offhand comment that you made to me, so I don't want to drill too much into the specifics of it. But in your perception, how much do you think Marx was acting at the behest of some kind of larger forces that were kind of using him as a gateway to bring this in?
so
And this is getting into the kind of egregore
I was
idea.
gonna say, if we think about it like the egregore thing, so an egregore then is a thought form. And so it might be helpful to think about it as an individual thing. So the egregore then an individual thought form. Sometimes people talk about them as complexes, right? I have an inferiority complex or a right. So that's like you have a pattern of thinking that's limiting you in some way or guiding you in some way or affecting you in some way. And Marx says that an egregore is a social control mechanism. And so there, I think like that idea of having a complex, a psychological complex, right? That's a limit. It limits you or forms your personality in a limited way is a helpful thing. I gave this example um, before, but I'll just briefly say it again. When I was a kid, my cousin, his mom would always say he's shy. So we were like 5 years old. His mom would introduce him and she would say, here, here's Craig. And then she would say, he's shy. And so
Hmm.
probably what happened was like once, he hid behind her leg or something when he was like 2. And then she just like made it like a thing and just kept enforcing it. And so he didn't talk to adults through high school. Like, we were little kids. He was all weird when adults would come around. We'd be just doing our thing, playing, and then an adult would come and he'd be weird. He wouldn't talk. We'd have to say, Craig needs something to drink. Craig need, like it was really strange. But it was because this thought form, right, which is a kind
Hmm.
of egregore, because it actually was collective. We all bought into it. I didn't know I'm the little kid. I'm like, oh, he's met. I thought there was some real problem here. I didn't know. I thought
Right.
he had an issue. So, we all bought into it. And so, he acted that way and we would feed into it because we would talk for him and on his behalf and all that. So that would be like a kind of simple egregore, right? And then you can have a more what I think we think about communism, Marxism. It's a world historic egregore, right? It's
Hmm.
been around for a long time. And I mentioned this when I spoke with Miguel, and um I'll mention it again because there's different. He has a Gnostic thing, so it gets a little bit complicated. But Judas is basically a communist. There's actually a this socialist folk singer. I think he's an Irish guy, Leon Rosselson. He has a song called "Stand Up for Judas." He's with the people.
Hmm.
All right, so it's a socialist song saying that Judas was the one that was for the poor, and Jesus was the one that was pie in the sky. Right, from the socialist perspective, God isn't real, so any discussion about the divine is just um, delusions for the masses, opiate for the masses. So stand up for Judas. He's with the people, and if you think about those gospel stories, Judas when Martha's sister Mary, not his mother, but her sister, is washing his feet with the perfume, the Pernard. Judas is like, "Why didn't you sell that and give it to the poor?" And that idea right there is that's the socialist egregore, and
Right.
you hear that I think dominates a lot of the churches. Like you were saying, like the girl doing pornography, God loves me no matter what I do. And so like a lot of these like churches now are just like youth hostiles for like psychologically like kids that are getting like screwed up from the culture,
Mhm.
and they're just like basically youth hostiles, and the churches themselves are just soup kitchens, and
Right.
there's no real spiritual life there, and serving the poor becomes the entirety of the
Mhm.
operation. And that that's an old idea, right? And that's literally the Judas idea. um and when Notre Dame was burned, you heard the same thing. When the structure was built, we shouldn't rebuild, we should just give the money to the poor, feed people in Africa or whatever. So, I'm not saying we should be callous to poor people, but this idea that everything can be reordered so that people who aren't able to work for whatever reason are fed is just not a good way of organizing the society. And that was what Jesus said, right? You always have the poor with you. There's things that have to be put first. God, if you put God first, everything else will fall into place, right?
Right.
And so that's actually the way out of the Kali Yuga, and the Judas way is the way deeper into it.
Hmm.
Right, it's more materialism and more confusion, and you know it's having a soup kitchen is a fine thing, but solving world poverty, that's like trying to do that is a disaster. That's
Right.
actually an it solving the poverty in your family is a way better project, or even your neighborhood. But to think about it as a world thing, because that's how you get to eat bugs, live in the pod, soy
Right.
lent, right? Because if Idaho's job is to feed Somalia, that's not going to work.
Right.
That can't work.
It's also it's interesting because just while we were talking, a thought that occurred to me is, we human inspiration, right? Like, because we, like you were just saying, everything to these people who are possessed by this egregore, everything has to be no, no, no. Money's all, everything's got to go to the poor, and including like if somebody's inspired to build a rocket to take us to the moon, or
Right.
somebody's inspired to make a great work of art, anything, it's like, yeah, that's a waste of money. It's all about the poor. And it's just an interesting aspect connecting it, again, back to the whole Kali Yuga concept of this anti-spiritual time when we're disconnected from our higher selves, from God, and from all of these things. Because, like, I've been reading a lot of Swedenborg lately, but Swedenborg, Steiner, lots of people have said this. Marx says this about how, like, throughout the day we have positive and negative impulses, and they're actually it's like spiritual forces. And when we're inspired to create something beautiful and uplifting, that's a godly impulse. It's like a moral and God-given inspiration to do something beautiful and do something meaningful. And then you have the socialist egregore, this idea of like, no, 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 no. there's only one thing that's good. And it's just kind of an interesting thought that it's this period of cutting us off from our inspiration, which could be perceived as God delivering a message to us about something positive that we're supposed to undertake. And we're just being cut off from everything, and everything's being driven into what seems in a philosophical way virtuous, but really isn't. It doesn't feel that way. Like it crushes your own spirit if you're like, if like I'm a great sculptor and I want to sculpt beautiful works of art, and somebody just steps on that and says, "Nah, man, nah. Unless you're feeding the poor, nothing you're doing is any good at all."
So that's exactly why I ended my band.
Really?
Same exact thing, right? This is a waste of time. Making music is a waste of time. What I should be doing is knocking on doors, trying to organize a socialist revolution. So
Hmm.
that right, that doing music is a waste of time. And now, of course, people like Rage Against the Machine would make a different argument, right? We're spreading the message, blah blah. Blah. But I was like, no, this is more militant than they are. This is the band is a waste of time. We should be, knocking on doors and spreading the socialist message, organizing our newspaper and etc. um we weren't into soup kitchens because we said that's not good enough. We need to take over the side and then give everything, then do it. But if you do that, you can see that this is nothing will work, and you won't actually be able to feed anybody. Everyone will be poor. Everyone,
Right,
right?
right,
Nothing's gonna work. But that idea, I think you're right. It's a spiritual idea, or it's an anti-spiritual idea posing as a spiritual idea, posing as a moral thing. And so it pulls on your compassion and your spiritual impulses, but it takes us deeper into materialism. And
hmm,
it's like the Tower of Babel. It's the same idea, right? We somehow humanity can solve these problems, and that's how you get the worship of science, all this weird um believe the science stuff. Like
right,
that doesn't make any sense. That's not what science is. Science isn't something you believe in,
right,
right? That's
right,
not how it works. Like that's not what science is. I mean, I'm interested in science, but I would separate those things from spiritual life to a degree. But science is about doubt and skepticism and disproving. And if you're really a scientist, you have a hypothesis that you're going to try relentlessly to disprove, right?
right,
That's science, not something you believe in that has a consensus around it. So, to get back to the idea of the egregore, I think that there's, whether or not it's like a cosmic, how big are the forces that are pushing us um that way, it's hard to say. But like I said, I think Judas is an expression of that. And
hmm,
that's I mean, if you really think about it, you have an incarnation of the divine, and it's murdered right right here. And so that's pretty dark, if you really
right,
think about
yeah,
it. It's pretty dark. um
right,
and so you can make a story up where that it was done on purpose and that's actually the plan and blah blah blah. But okay, but what if it's the story came after the fact that there was a divine incarnation, they got murdered?
right,
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 I mean, so that's a that's so that's I think that is a cosmic thing, you
right.
know.
It's talking about these like greater forces. I mean, like I play with those thoughts all the time. Steiner, and some people say Steiner. I guess that's the proper way to pronounce
The,
it.
the,
But I just like to pronounce how I read it.
it's
But
Jung or Young.
right. Like Steiner talked about how like the Lucifer and Ahriman. And he talked about these things differently than to him. Lucifer was it was like the inspirational impulse, like the emotional impulse, the uplifting impulse. And if you have too much Lucifer, you became like flaky and just those kinds of people that are just kind of wandering around. Their heads are in the clouds and they suck at life. Now
Right,
they might
right,
be good people, but they're not grounded. Ahriman was the opposing force, which was this very intellectual, no emotion, cold. And he said that all like human beings, we walk in between these two forces, but so too does the earth as a whole. These two forces are always pulling us, and we're supposed to be seeking that middle way. Which is also Mark talks about the middle path a lot in
Right.
between. He doesn't use the Ahriman Lucifer concepts, but to me, it's kind of like the same thing in a way.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I actually forget where I was going with that. Oh, and so with the socialist thing, like we talk about this absolute rigid intellectualism, and this to me it's very cold. Like I find socialists to be very cold people,
Mhm.
and they might be fiery and they might be obsessed with their ideas, but to me, most socialists that I've met are cold people, kind of joyless, very overly serious. And so to me, it's interesting to look at these two forces pulling us in these two different directions. And Steiner actually talked about the age of Ahriman, which is, he said,
Mm.
like what we're living through right now.
Right. Right.
And then there's this whole thing with the eighth sphere, which is interesting. Like Dark Journalist has been talking about this eighth sphere thing, but whatever. I don't want to get off on a tangent. But when you look at this, to me, that's interesting because you have the Kali Yuga concept, but also this concept that there's two polar opposite forces pulling us at all times. And when one becomes unbalanced, we get a situation like we have today, which like too much Ahriman in a way. But the thing that I like about Steiner's concept and about the Kali Yuga as well, this isn't the end. This is a grim stage, but it's going somewhere and it's going someplace really good, man. Like this is kind of, and I just like to put this in because there's so much like despair and fear right now.
Right.
And to me, it's like, let's remember, man, we're going someplace good. Like this is kind of that time period where you had to go into the mountains and retire and live in the cave for, 40 days or whatever. But we're going to come out of it and it's going to be better. And I think that since we're talking about the Kali Yuga, it's just to me like an important thing to bring up. This isn't the end of time. This is the end of a cycle, and we're going to begin the new cycle, the golden age. And so, do you know like the Kali Yuga? How do they frame it? Like when it comes to an end, do we go right into this new golden age, or does it start ramping back up towards a golden age? Like, are you sure about this, like specifics about how
I'm
this is
not.
supposed to play out?
not, not. So one thing to because I don't want to speak too much about that which I don't know, but the point that you were making earlier, I think that there are words or concepts for energies and forces that, right, so it's all words. And so language is an inherent falsity in language, right? Because it's one degree of separation from the thing. Perhaps it could be that you know, you don't use the Lord's name in vain because in some way the name is the thing, right? The
Hmm.
symbol and the thing are not separate. And I think there's something to that. But at the same time, like we're talking about Kali Yuga versus the Iron Age, or the Vikings, I think called it the Wolf Age, or like this idea that you're raising of Steiner, like they're words that are pointing at the same thing, right? The
Right.
map, not the territory kind of thing. So we have concepts that are trying to get us into the same idea, or the same energy, the same background. Um, so to get out of it, I don't know to be honest, I don't know how that looks according to the kind of scriptures or the prophecies of it. I mean, in Revelations, Jesus comes back, right? And
Right.
I
Right.
think there's the similar idea in Hinduism that one of the avatars of Vishnu Indra
Hmm.
will come, and and so I mean, um, I think that in some ways God acts through us, and so it will, I don't know if it'll be such a ghost in the machine kind of thing, but uh, at the same time, I don't know. I don't want to say that I do because I don't. I have hot. I mean, every time it gets really dark to me, every time I see something really grim, I see there's a bright side in there, I think. I just saw, like all this like AI stuff and all these, Google images and everything that's coming out and it's like all like weird. And I'm like, this is probably a good
Right.
thing, because a lot of what's being exposed is not Google AI. It's actually stuff that's deeply embedded in our culture that we haven't been
Right.
able to talk about and root out. And now it's out in the open, and maybe it'll be easier to, to straighten it out and fix it. So I think there's a bright side. Um, you know, so
No, yeah.
here's another way that you can think about the Kali Yuga ending, maybe. Um, there's the fourth turning guys that talk about generations. So
Strauss and
that,
Levi, I think, were their
yeah,
names.
yeah,
Yeah.
and Neil Howe, that he's out there a lot, and they're saying like 2030, there's going to be, if you go by like generational changes throughout history, it's coming to a head. Um, but there's a lot of chaos and mayhem before that happens. But like sometimes, like, certainly when I was 20, chaos and mayhem was something I would have welcomed. I still probably have enough energy to welcome it. But
Right. Just get
so
back to
who
bashing
knows?
people's heads in for your dinner.
We'll see. We'll see.
Right. Yeah, man, something that amazes me is the book of Revelations, where they talk about like all of the secrets becoming exposed. That's one thing that what we're living through right now. So much is just coming to the surface now. And that always strikes me with the book of Revelations. But um, you mentioned or about taking the Lord's name in vain. Just wanted to quickly share an interesting thing that I think it was Gurdjieff himself who said this, but it might have been one of his students. But like Gurdjieff had this idea that we have these centers in our body. I think there were four centers. There's like the instinct center, the moving center, these various centers. But the vocal center, obviously it has its place, but it's a lower center. And fourth way people, I do not have this memorized perfectly, but I believe I'm getting the general concepts right. That the spiritual center is higher, and so you don't want to speak about God or divine beings of any kind lightly, because you're passing them through a lower center. You're kind of like, by the very fact, you should only speak about them when you're doing so with reverence or with like an intentional meaning. Like I think me saying it right now would be okay because I'm trying to have a meaningful conversation, but just spouting it out, you're putting it through a lower order of your own self, and so you're in that way you're kind of like denigrating it in your own being, and you're making it kind of profane. So I
I
don't know, I
think
just thought
that's,
that was
it's an
interesting.
interesting point, because I try very hard not to use divine names in vain, and then you're around people in public and they're just throwing out
Right.
cursing, basically just cursing all the time, and so if I'm like friendly with a person, I'll say, like, I'll just say like, Jesus doesn't have anything to do with that. And they'll
Right.
be like, like, but but it's interesting to think that you're not hurting Jesus, you're hurting yourself. Like, you're hurting
Right.
your own
Exactly.
ability
Exactly.
to connect to the divine. Like, that's what
Right.
you're really doing, is separating yourself. Um, and yeah, I think that's right. Like, you're disconnecting, right? You're disconnecting your ability to be connected to higher power. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why when I read that from Gurdjieff or one of his students, whatever it was long ago, that's when I started to give it more heed. I was like, yeah, that actually makes sense. And so I try my best to be careful. But it's hard. It's the way I speak off the cuff, man. I use profane, like it's one of my weaknesses. But I do try. I try my best.
No, I mean, we live in the I mean, I think about that all the time too. Like, we live in the Kali Yuga. We live in this culture that's very, it's so profane, that it's almost hard to like imagine what it would be like if it weren't. Like,
Right.
it's so like the movies, like, unless you're like going to become a hermit, you're always swimming in it. and
Right.
and I mean, so one of the things that's interesting, speaking of the Lord's name, there was the Prabhupada, the Hare Krishna guy, the guy that introduced chanting Hare Krishna,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Allen Ginsberg was into him and stuff. I mean, his thing is that because it's the Kali Yuga, the benefit of living in the Kali Yuga is that all you have to do is chant the name of God to be saved,
Hmm.
because everything else is too confusing.
Huh.
So, right, it's just everything else is such a mess that
Dude, yeah,
all
I
you have
dig.
to do
That's
is
really
take
cool,
refuge in the
man.
name. Yeah, it's cool. I really like Prabhupada. There's something I find really attractive about him. I think he's just like, because he's kind of a weird looking dude, but
Yeah.
there's like a lot of dignity about him. Like, even though like he's like just strange looking, you know, and
Yeah, his life story is amazing. Like that guy was not
yeah,
messing around, man.
no, he
Like
wasn't messing around.
the level of faith that he put in, like is that guy's life is amazing, man. And that's
And
like I know the everybody calls him the Hare Krishnas, and they have a like that great airport scene where the dude knocks the one out. But you know, like people talk badly about them, but I watched a documentary on that the life of the man who brought it
Prabhupada,
over
yeah,
here.
yeah,
And
right.
I was like, dude, this is not light stuff. Like this guy was serious, man, and he meant everything, and he was
Right.
a legitimate,
Took
I
real
would say,
risks. Yeah,
like a
took
prophet. Like he
chances, risks. Yep.
yeah, yeah, it's an amazing dude, and his life story is amazing, and I do think you have to respect that. So I try not to. I no longer like laugh at the Hare Krishna thing. I want to respect it because I think it's a legitimate.
I love chanting Hare Krishna. I love it.
Oh,
I
really?
oh yeah. I mean, because maybe we'll talk about this in the future, but like if you read the Bhagavad Gita, it's God addressing a warrior, and that's Prabhupada's main book, right? The Bhagavad Gita is the one that he's constantly referring to, and so it's God addressing a warrior, telling the warrior to do his duty, that even though he doesn't want to fight in this war because it's against his relatives and people that he honors and respects, that he still has to participate, and without hatred and so forth, but he still has to participate. And so the whole idea is really, I think, really interesting. And in the Kali Yuga, I don't. So if you listen to people analyze it now, they're always like, "Oh, it's metaphorical. It's really about nonviolence." I'm like, it's not metaphorical. It's God talking to a warrior. The warrior
Mm-hmm.
class is the closest to God. Like, it's Brahmins and then warriors. Like, that's how it is in Plato. That's how it is in the caste system. And so this isn't a metaphor. He's talking to a man who's literally a warrior, a man who bears arms. Like, this is not. There's no metaphor. And people
Right.
will say, "I'm a warrior." It's like, I mean, maybe you are, but do you train with arms? Do you train, like, what are you talking about? You're a warrior.
Right. Right.
It's
No,
not a
that's
metaphor,
really cool, man.
right? It's not metaphorical. And the Socrates thing in the Republic, right? He was, if you read like the Apology, he's like, he compare himself to Achilles.
Hmm.
He's like, I'm acting like Achilles acted. I'm doing what Achilles would do in my position. And that's where the philosopher kings come from, the warrior class, because bravery and courage are the necessary ingredients for all virtue, right? There's nothing else is possible if you're a coward,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that there's that great speech at the end of Enter the Dragon when the bad guy's talking to Bruce Lee, and he encapsulates that idea beautifully, man. But yeah, like yeah, we've been talking for a while. I don't want to keep you any longer on this, but I do. We touch a little bit. You and I have emailed a bit about this concept of the warrior aspect of being removed from spirituality, and so I actually was not. I did not realize that the warrior caste was like considered that high in
Yeah, yeah, right.
ancient Hindu culture and ancient Greek culture. And that I love that. Like I need to look into that more because that's something I've thought a lot about is I don't I do understand how. It's largely because of interpretations of the New Testament of Jesus, and anybody out there's a Christian. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm open for debate. But you know, the whole thing about turn the other cheek and this kind of ultra pacifism. And maybe that is accurate. I mean, Gandhi lived that, lots of the Thoreau, like people have lived that. Maybe that is legitimate. But to me, when I look at the history of spirituality, including ancient Christianity, ironically enough, like the warrior aspect was recognized as being a virtue. It was not a vice. And now, like everybody perceives this as like all combat, all war, that whole Mars energy that's all looked at from the perspective of like the berserker and the destructive, aimless person. But that's only one aspect to it. Like the disciplined warrior who's willing to give his life on the field for his people, and who has put his ego enough aside enough that he can stand in a phalanx with his other soldiers and just keep his role with trust in his fellow beings. Those are spiritual. That's a spiritual development in my perception.
Yeah.
And I think it's weird that it's been like extracted from our culture and from how we perceive spirituality, you know?
I would say I totally agree. And that if you think about like the ideas of pranayama, right, breath control, that definitely comes out of warrior experience, right? Because the
Right,
first thing
right,
you realize, right, is that you have to control your breathing. Otherwise, this is you're going to be exhausted in a
right.
minute, right? You can't like you have like so. I think breath control is coming right out of warrior culture. Um,
Oh man, dude,
my
yeah,
my
that's
experience
really
like in
interesting.
jujitsu was like the first day I was like, wow, I got to figure out how to get my breath under control. I thought I was like, I went into it, I was meditating stuff. I was like, I really got to learn how to control my breathing, right? Because this is I'm screwed here. Like
Right, right. No,
if
yeah,
I
dude,
can't.
I've done grappling. I also do striking arts and include just like boxing and kickboxing. I actually used to compete for a little while in kickboxing. But yeah, you have to like have perfect control of your breath
Yeah,
because you know,
it's crucial,
like
right?
that's why when boxers, you know this, I'm saying this for other people's, like
Yeah,
when you hear boxers when they throw a punch,
right.
you hear that it's the controlled release of breath, so they're not blowing all their oxygen out all the time. But
Right, and that's breath control, right? I mean,
right, right.
that's a yoga, right? It's a yoga.
Absolutely, yeah. And also like when you start to feel yourself start to tire a little bit, you learn how to chill yourself out a bit, give your breathing some time to stabilize. And not you just develop kind of a kinesthetic sense for your breathing and you can feel yourself heading towards fatigue. And so you can kind of and that's why pressure fighters are so dangerous because they don't give their opponents the chance
Right,
to get back to their breath. They just stay on top of them and it just compounds and compounds until you're exhausted.
right,
And
right.
you know,
So
but like a
they're
trained
thinking
fighter
about that.
knows
Yeah,
how to
yeah,
get their
right,
breath back.
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
What's up?
No, you're right. I agree. Agreed. I mean, if you watch like a UFC fight, Joe Rogan will always comment on where the guy is in his breathing, if he's breathing through his mouth, right? And so
Right.
that's like, and the Hickson Gracie stuff, like, is he does. I've seen him. He's in the Hulk movie, showing the Hulk how to like control his anger, doing breath control stuff. But he's doing all that breath control. Like I've heard him talk about like getting his breathing up really high before the fight, and then coming down really low, so he's all warmed up, but his breath he's got his heartbeats down to whatever 40 a second, or whatever, 40 a minute. He's like really thinking about that stuff. I think that it's super it's where it's coming from. I think the
Right.
pranayama comes out of the warrior. It certainly does, because if you think about what Plato is saying, he's saying the philosopher kings are warriors first. The philosopher kings are drawn from the warrior cast,
Hmm.
right? So it's a so that they have, right, they're training as warriors, and then some of them have a philosophical nature, and they develop into a philosopher king. That's the
Hmm.
that's the idea. And I but agreed that we're that's all, we're so disconnected from that. I don't know that it's, I mean, yeah, Nietzsche said it was Christianity. Jesus is definitely brave, right? He
Right. Right.
says the greatest thing is to lay down your life for your friends.
And
Uh,
even turning the other cheek, he doesn't say run. Turning the other cheek is to say, "All right, hit me on this side now." You know,
so that's
it's
a
kind
different
of like,
thing.
all right, motherfucker." You know, like hit me again, dude. You know.
That is a different thing. And I think if you're and also if it's cowardice, if the reason you don't fight is because you're afraid of fighting. I mean, Gandhi even says that, right? Nonviolence doesn't work without the capacity to be violent. If it's just you're afraid or weak, there's no virtue in that. You haven't done anything. You're just making a virtue of getting your butt kicked, but you already got your butt kicked anyway. So
Right. Right.
it doesn't, it doesn't matter. Um,
Right.
so but yeah, it's easy to manipulate that stuff. And we were talking about chivalry and the Crusader stuff, and that's all in there. And the first converts to Christianity were the Roman soldiers. So there's a lot, there's a lot there to like unpack that it's certainly buried now. It's definitely not the spiritual scene, or the, I don't know, the occult scene is definitely not, there's not a warrior, at least not a celebrate, not a literal warrior. There's a lot of
Right.
metaphorical celebration of the warrior, but not a literal thing. And
Right.
I think that's bad for the culture. I think it's bad for soldiers. I think it's bad for guys that serve. Because it's
Absolutely. Yeah.
disconnecting them from things, and then forcing them into the PTSD thing, which, and then better or worse treatments for that, right? And some of them
Right.
aren't great.
No, I agree. And for everybody out there, I'm a veteran. I was the Second Ranger Battalion, got 5 combat deployments. I'll say what I want about PTSD. And yeah, man, like I had to deal with my own stuff, and I did not like how I I won't go in too deep into it, but I did not deal with it the way they said I should deal with it. And I wouldn't say, I don't know if I had like full blown. Well, I guess I probably must have, considering everything that I lived through. But I didn't perceive it the way they perceived it, as like you're a broken, fragile being that needs.
That's exact that. And it is it we I would love to, if you're up for that. It would be a great topic. I think it would be helpful to others. um you know I'm not a veteran, didn't serve. I was in that anti-war thing when I was younger, but I I have a lot of admiration and respect, and it would be really, I think, helpful to other people that to talk about it a little bit, because it seems like to construct the veteran as this, like you said, broken, because you're like, I don't even know if I had PTSD. Sure, you had some sort, like you're living under this hugely stressful environment for a long time. Like that's has an effect, but it doesn't
Right,
mean that you're like, destroyed by it and withered by it. It could mean you're the philosopher king, that you're now a man that
right,
understands war and has wisdom and isn't going to put people in dumb situations for no reason. Like there, there's a whole different way of um constructing that subject, the warrior, after the war, um,
right.
than what's happening now. And I think part of it is because young veterans would be the most dangerous people to the current order if they
Hmm.
were organized or conscious, or had some image of what the world might be. They're certainly the most dangerous. So having them, in a way, you could think of it as an egregore, right? The broken
Oh
soldier
yeah,
is a
dude.
kind
Yeah,
of
man.
it's a mindset. And I'm not, I don't want to say that guys that are suffering are whatever, but there's something there. I think it would be interesting to think about it.
No, I agree, man. Yeah, and we'll draw this to a close. We've been going for a while, but I would love to talk about that again. But real quick, I just want to say, because you sparked a thought. I remember shortly after I got out reading somebody, because I disagreed with how they framed PTSD. So I was looking into it, and this was coming from a clinical perspective. And it was a mainstream clinical perspective. And what the dude was saying was the real problem with PTSD is that people see what they are actually capable of, which they did not realize that they were capable of before. Basically, you do things that you really regret. And it creates all these fissures and problems in your psyche because it breaks up your entire concept of who you thought you were. And the thing is, I had that experience. Absolutely. Being in war changed my life, but I didn't perceive it as being broken. I perceived it as, now I understand what I really am. You know what? That's okay. It's not okay to let it loose, but it's okay to know that it's there. And like, I look at it as wisdom, like a profound wisdom that I'm very grateful for. And I do like the moral aspects. I pray every day, and there are things that, like I don't want to get into politics of that, but I no longer feel real assured that I was on the good side. We'll put it that way. However, as far as the other aspects to it, I look at it as wisdom. Like, yeah, now I see who I really am, and I'm grateful for that. And I think people would benefit if they understood that it's a positive thing, you know?
Absolutely. And the moral aspect, not to go down a rabbit hole, I think the moral aspect is, were you loyal to the guys you're with when you're fighting? I
Right,
mean, that's all that can be asked of a soldier, I think. Like,
right.
to like actually investigate the the details of the war, and who's, I that's, you're on your country's side, and because what, I mean, so to go, let's get into it, but quickly to go back to the Republic, the reason the warrior caste emerges, and when Socrates is discussing, is because the city has got to such a point where they want luxury goods, and once you go beyond like bare necessities, then you're gonna have war.
Hmm,
And so it's just us against them. You know what I mean? Like, it's
right,
just, and however us is defined and however they're defined, that's the morals of it. It's just us against them. And like,
right.
unless you're gonna give up all luxuries and live this base thing, that's that's really what it is.
Right. And to the moral thing, and again, this will be my last statement for real, man. I could tell you, but I want to save this so we can like encapsulate it in one
Yeah.
discussion. But maybe this is positive because I completely just forgot what I was going to say.
So let's have a discussion of this though. That would be great. But go ahead. If you have your idea.
Yeah, yeah. No, actually, I actually literally completely forget what I was going to say. Oh, we had been talking about, so you lose every. Oh, yeah. When we talk about the morality of war, something that always bugs me and comes from the socialist types, but it comes from all types. You have people be like, oh, human beings were just like driven for war and blah, blah, blah. That's not fair, though, because the reality of the situation is you could have a room with 100 people who don't want war. It only takes one guy to come in through the door with a baseball bat swinging, and you have to go to war to protect everybody else. And we're basically living in a world where somebody keeps running into the room with a baseball bat. And to me, it doesn't make any sense to be like, "Oh, you all suck. We all crave war. You all want destruction." Like, no, dude, actually, most of us just want to hang out and talk, but people keep running in with baseball bats. And so we have to do something about it. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it's like, it's so pompous. It's pompous to me to just say people who are involved in war are just lower forms of humanity. Humanity's so wretched. It's kind of what we've been thrown into. And if you believe in God, and I do believe in God, God has constructed this thing for a reason. And I have faith that it's been built this way for a reason. War is part of it. It says in Ecclesiastes, there's time for everything, including war. Hopefully, when I die, I will understand God's design. I don't yet, but I can look around and see that war is apparently a part of it. And so, if we pretend it's not, I just think you're kind of like being pompous and kind of just being full of shit, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, what you said about learning what you're capable of is also, it makes it makes your ability to be virtuous a much more serious thing. I mean, right? Your ability to be a non-violent person has much more meaning because of your ability to engage in
Right.
violence. If you have no ability to engage in violence, your morality,
You're just weak.
you're just weak. You just have incapacity, and you're parading as a virtuous person because you're not capable of doing anything. And that's,
Right.
I mean, whatever. That's not anything. That's nothing.
Right.
I mean, if being moral
Yeah.
is just cowering in the corner, then what is it? I mean, that's right.
Right. Yeah. And Jordan Peterson is resurrect. Like Jordan Peterson talks about that a lot, which is awesome, getting that into people's minds. But man, Keith, this has been friggin' awesome, man. Let's definitely do this again. Yeah, I mean, we'll just email after this, dude. I would love, got all sorts of stuff to talk about, dude. So if you're down with it, I'd love to, man.
Yeah, I had a great time.
Awesome, dude. Yeah, I'll email with you again. I'll let you know when this goes live, and yeah, I'll just talk to you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, dude. Thanks. Have a good one, man.
Apple Knocker Radio.